Hello all. I'm Anusha Mohan and I work as a senior project manager with IQVIA. I carry an experience of close to 6 years with different organizations like Dell Technologies, IQVIA and ENY. I have also worked in multiple roles like Scrum Master, Project Manager, Program and Portfolio Manager. I'm also a PMP, CAPM, ITIL, and CIS certified.
Sometimes projects don't go always as planned. You may encounter resource shortages and have to find ways to adapt to ensure project deliverables aren't affected. That's where resource leveling comes into the picture. It allows you to readjust timelines so that a project can be finished with the available resources. With this technique, you can allocate resources accordingly to ensure goals and objectives are met. In this video, we will see how resource leveling works and what basically is a resource leveling. So, what is a resource leveling? A resource leveling is a project management technique that involves resolving over allocation or scheduling conflicts to ensure a project can be completed with the available resources. Resources includes the time, materials, or tools needed to complete a project. Resource leveling, by definition, is a resource optimization technique that answers when the project can be finished with the available resources without overbooking them or spreading them too thin. Resource leveling will generally aim to distribute work between resources fairly, which not only contributes to a healthy work environment but also makes the project schedule realistic and achievable. Here, an obvious example of resource leveling would be moving start and end dates of tasks to balance the workloads and to avoid over or under allocation of resources. Here, what it meant exactly by those terms. While over allocated resources have more work than they can complete within their normal 8 hours schedule, under allocated resources have spare time to dedicate to the project and task. Resource leveling will straighten out over allocation by reallocating task start and end dates, as in the example shown on the screen. Let's assume that a web designer is allocated for 8 hours each day to a project during the resource allocation process. However, in the original project plan, you notice that he is assigned two different tasks he cannot physically complete in 2 days. We all know that one person can't be in two places simultaneously. Now, the resource leveling will reschedule these two tasks so that are carried out on different days. It will untangle the conflict immediately. Overall, resource leveling aims to prevent such cases from happening and make sure that first, people don't have unrealistic workload. Second, tasks aren't delegated to the same people over and over again. So, when do you use resource leveling? Resource leveling prevents resources from being spread too thin while ensuring projects still have what they need to succeed. This technique contributes to not only project management but also helps maintain work life balance for the team. Here are some reasons why your team can benefit from resource leveling. To optimize your resources, it lets you get the most out of the resources you have on hand. It helps you assess which project should receive additional resources and which ones are flexible in terms of deadlines. It also minimizes defects. Resource leveling prevents significant project delays, thereby minimizing the losses in cost and labor. This technique allows you to manage the resource demand without exceeding the company's current capacity and financial resources. It also prevents task overloading. Over allocation of resources leads to overwork, which can be overwhelming for team members and stakeholders. Resource leveling prevents this by resolving over allocation issues and adjusting deadlines to ensure that the team members don't have too much on their plates. It also ensures that the quality of the project output is good. Leveling allows you to manage both resources and clients' expectations by maintaining the same level of quality for project deliverables. In general, resource leveling can be a useful technique for resolving budget issues, resource allocation and overallocation, and project delays. Now, there are different techniques by which you can do a resource leveling. Adding project resource leveling to your arsenal of skills will help you become a more effective leader. Here are some resource leveling strategies you can apply to your team. Critical path method. The critical the critical path method is a common resource leveling technique that is used to calculate project duration without taking resource limitation into account. This technique involves linking dependent project activities in a logical sequence in order to calculate the earliest and the latest possible dates that each activity can start and finish by. The critical path refers to the sequence of tasks with the longest duration that needs to be completed in order to successfully close out a project. The second technique is a critical chain method. A critical chain method is an updated version of the critical path method. Unlike the critical path method, the critical chain method takes resources limitation into account. In this case, the critical chain refers to the longest path of task, taking into account both task and resource dependencies. A resource can only be allocated to one task at a time. Project scheduling using this method involves listing required resources for tasks and reassessing their availability when needed. The critical chain method includes a buffer period, which is placed between the last task and the project finish date, acting as a contingency for the critical chain activity. Tasks that finish early increase the buffer. Conversely, delays in critical chain activities use up this buffer but won't affect the project completion date. For example, to publish a piece of content on time, the manager determines the resource needed, maybe a writer, an editor, a designer, and a developer. They set a buffer of 5 days in case there are delays between content or design review. The critical chain method aims for realistic estimates of project duration and resources so that projects finish on time without overextending resources. Moving on to the different leveling techniques, crashing. When fast tracking can't be applied or it's not effective enough, you can implement the crashing technique. This is where additional resources are allocated to a project to shorten the timeline. In this case, you have to access the needs of high priority tasks and look for resources options that provide the most value at the least cost. For example, the marketing team needs two more writers since their deadline has moved up by 2 days. With no spare team members, the project manager decides to hire two freelancers they have worked with before rather than spending time looking for new writers. Before you decide to use crashing to compress project schedules, be sure to get approval from your manager or client about obtaining additional resources. While for the fast tracking, there are times when projects must be delivered on or before the deadline to satisfy client requirements. In those cases, you can use fast tracking to run multiple parallel tasks to speed up the project. This schedule compression technique can only work if the activities can be overlapped with one another to a certain extent. For instance, activities with dependencies can be staggered, and activities without dependencies can occur in parallel. An example of fast tracking is when the software development team starts building the backend of a website while the design team is finishing up the website mockup. With the fast tracking technique, the work gets done on time and on budget, but there's always a higher possibility of rework. Now that we have a rough idea of how the resource leveling techniques work, we will go to why is resource leveling so important? It is important because it eliminates over allocation. By balancing the demand of project tasks with resource capacity, resource leveling removes the risk of over allocating resources. It also enhances the productivity and reduces the burnout. By removing over allocation, the risk of resource burnout is reduced. Productivity is also improved and resources can focus on the highest priority work without juggling over tasks. It also ensures that the quality of output remains intact. When the resources can focus on a single task, the likelihood of a quality outcome increases. Now, while we are studying about the resource leveling, there's also a term resource smoothing which is common while we are doing an allocation of the resources. And it is natural that we get confused between the resource leveling versus smoothing. So, to get rid of that confusion, we will go through what basically is a resource leveling and what is a resource smoothing. So, both resource leveling and resource smoothing can be considered resource management techniques. The primary difference between the two is the project constraints that is prioritized. Resource smoothing prioritizes time constraints, whereas resource leveling focus on the availability of the resources. Here's an example. Say you're booked to work on a task for 8 hours for 5 days, but you only need 30 hours to finish this task. So you redistribute the schedule to 6 hours a day. By doing so, you have more leeway to work on other tasks without affecting the project deadline. Resource leveling is used when there's resource overallocation, whereas resource smoothing is used when there's an uneven allocation of resources. Resource leveling comes with the flexibility of moving the project dates around, but project dates are set when you are using a resource smoothing technique. After using resource leveling to resolve overallocation conflicts, you can use resource smoothing to even out the project schedule. While in resource leveling, tasks can be delayed beyond the float period. In resource smoothing, tasks can only be delayed within the float period. I hope you have understood what basically is resource leveling, what are the techniques, and what is the difference between resource leveling and smoothing. For any queries, please feel free to reach out to us at info@techcanvass.com. You can also give us a call at +91 93 255 66777.